Local Legends is about people, places, and history from Fairfield and surrounding areas that have achieved legendary status. We have an amazing community and are proud to share it with you. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome to Local Legends. I'm your host, Tony Wade. And today we have a gentleman with me who, if I had to introduce him and say all the things that he'd done, I would need a whole bunch of commas. So, but one of the things he is an Armiel High School legend. He's an NFL legend, and he's a humanitarian legend as well. And that's Mr. George Martin. George, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Tony. Thank you for having me.
Now, you didn't grow up here, right? I mean, you weren't born in Fairfield, right?
No, I was born in Greenville, South Carolina. My dad was in the military, so civilian service. So he was transferred a couple of times, and from South Carolina to Atlanta, Georgia, and eventually out to Fairfield, California, where I grew up since the 6th grade.
Okay, and when you got here, what was it like in terms of the difference between where you had lived?
It was, first of all, it was a metropolitan area for me because I grew up on a farm and it was very isolated, and we didn't have neighbors, and it was pretty poor. We were sharecroppers, so it was in stark contrast to moving to what we considered then a big city of Fairfield. At that time, 42,000. So it was like going from famine to feast.
And now, when you got here, you said you hadn't really been involved in any sports at all, right?
Didn't know anything about sports. As a matter of fact, my parents considered it a gross waste of time because they were, people who earned a living by the sweat of their brow. So being out on the farm and being out in the field and picking cotton and all that stuff, that's how we were measured as far as having a productive life, and that was the standard. And so coming out to California, where again it's a more metropolitan area, we were considered almost lazy because we didn't, go out to the fields and do something that commanded our sweat glands to overload.
And now you were in junior high, correct?
Yes.
At Dover?
I was at Dover, yes.
And now, so when you first started playing ball, what was the sport that really drew your attention? Was it basketball, football? Which one was it?
No, it was actually football. Surprisingly enough, I played football. I'd never played football before. I didn't know anything about it. So they threw this little rectangular ball around, and they kept throwing it, and I kept catching it. And to the point where they were so amazed, they gave me the nickname Sticky Fingers because I'd always catch the ball. So that was my introduction to sports overall, was football in junior high, and it just expanded from there to include both basketball and also tennis at one point in time. And
now you excelled at sports. You just kind of took off, from the get-go. And so, but what sort of coaching did you have going back to Dover and then at Armiel? Tell me about your coaches.
Well, I think that the most profound coaching I got was in high school. And that time, the gentleman who the current gym is now named after, Gary Vaughn, he was a very instrumental coach for me growing up. And then the most, I think, impactful coach that I ever had was Coach Hopkins. He was just, in fact, it was so magical for me that he considered me a part of his family, which was unheard of back in those days. There's this, African-American young lad and this white coach who had embraced him and nurtured him. And I just took to it like a duck to water because he made me feel so special.
Now, do you have any remembrances of your playing days that stick out to you that were particularly memorable, that were thought-provoking, that kind of thing?
Well, number one, I was I was a high school All-American in basketball, and that I'm very proud of. And I was an all-state football player, which subsequently got me viewed by a lot of colleges, and I subsequently was recruited for football, but not basketball, which kind of irked me a little bit because in my heart, I consider myself a basketball player. And the most insulting thing that happened was I was recruited by UCLA. So, and this was during the height of the Wooten and all the championships, right? So I go down to UCLA and I'm being recruited for football, and they show me the campus and everything, and then they take me by the gym and walk in the gym, and there's the prestigious hall, and there's John Wooten sitting there on the bench, and I'm walking by and I know he's gonna say something because I'm an All-American basketball player. Never said one word, not a word. So I was so humbled and angry at that point in time. I said, well, you know what? Oregon looks pretty good. I think I'll go to Oregon instead because they allowed me to play both basketball and football.
Oh, okay. All right. And now it wasn't just about sports for you though when you were at Army O.
Oh no! I was I was a late bloomer, number one, because my dad went to the 2nd grade and my mom went to the 8th grade. So education, and particularly higher education, was not held in high esteem, unfortunately, in my household. But thanks to my sister Brenda, who was 2 years older than me and preceded me in high school, she told me that I had to be a more complete individual than the examples that were presented to me. And the other thing that was such a motivator, Tony, if you recall, was the Vietnam War, which was raging. And every evening we would see the body bags and the coffins that came back, and they talked about the death count. And I was one of those prime individuals ready to be, thrusted into the Vietnam War. But fortunately, it caused me to focus on my education, and most importantly, the fact that the draft lottery came out. And I think I was 200 and something at that point in time, so I was never a draft candidate when I got to my senior year. But Bob Miller, who was also an instrumental high school football coach, said to me something that was very profound. And I think I was in my junior year going into my senior year. And he pulled me aside. He said, George, he says, you're a quintessential athlete. He says, you're one of a kind. He says, but realize this. He says, you're not a complete individual unless you focus on your education. And he said, do not, and I repeat, do not do it just for the sake of yourself. He says, you have a younger brother, my brother Doug, who's 5 years my junior. He says, you've got to set an example for the younger generation, and also for those individuals around you who are looking up to you, and there are a multitude of them, and they're not all black. And when he said that, I was like stunned. He says, you've got to set an example for the multitude. And of course, going into my senior year, I was also student body president of Army High School, and that broadened my responsibility overall, and I took it very seriously.
And then you met your wife when you were at Army. How'd that come about?
So you did your homework, didn't you?
Oh, yeah.
Got to be careful what you do. Yes, I did. I met my wife, Diane, and coincidentally, my older sister, Brenda, and her older sister, Ruth, were best buddies back in those days. And so when I was a sophomore or junior, my wife, Diane, my girlfriend, well, I didn't know her at the time, she came over to my house, and we were introduced by our respective sisters. And the first time that I was introduced to her, she came over, leaned over, and she kissed me on the cheek. I don't know what happened, Tony, but when I woke up days later, I was smitten. I could So, and that was sort of my first real girlfriend. And after that, we started dating. And eventually, when I went off to college, before I left, I proposed to her. And I gave her an engagement ring. And a year or two later, we got married. And this March 22nd, will be 50 years, Tony.
Is that 50 years?
50 years, yes.
That's amazing.
Never thought I could say that, yeah, but 50 years.
That is a blessing.
Yeah, it is
That's
indeed.
an absolute blessing.
Yeah, high school sweethearts. Yeah.
And so you go to college.
Yes.
And what was that like there?
It's a great unknown. It's almost like an astronaut leaving Earth and going to some place where he'd never seen, never heard, I didn't have any predecessors that had gone into that kind of environment, that venue. So I didn't get any counseling or any words of encouragement or warning. As a matter of fact, my mom kind of scoffed on it because, she was losing her son going into this environment. Right. She didn't know what to expect, But I knew that my options at home were limited, if non-existent. And so I looked upon it as a great opportunity, and I did because it was the great adventure. Now I get to go off and I get to learn out what this thing is called higher education, what it's all about. I get to be able to play sports on a higher level. I get to be able to explore my destiny. And we talked earlier about my art. I wanted to pursue my art. I wanted to be an art teacher. I wanted to pursue education. And so this was a great opportunity for me because I was going on uncharted territory for me as a Martin. And more importantly, I had to set an example for my younger brother, Doug, who was going to be following in my footsteps. And I wanted to make sure that I set a great example for him as well.
Now, did you have any goals to join to get into the NFL at that point?
Oh no, that was that wasn't even a pipe dream. It wasn't even a thought. To me, at that time, the NFL was, that was pie in the sky. That was, Candyville. I mean, how could you? The NFL? Are you kidding? Those are professionals. Those are big, strong, mean guys. I'd prefer to gravitate toward basketball. Where you don't get a hit as quite as often. Yeah. So no, it was never a desire of mine. And as a matter of fact, Tony, I played both sports. My first 2 years at Oregon, I played basketball and football. And I could quickly see that my basketball career was floundering. I was going to go anywhere with basketball. So I subsequently decided to stop. And as a means of maintaining my scholarship, I just played football for those remaining 2 years. And I had some notoriety, but nothing like All-American or all this and that. I was just a very good, multi-talented football player. I played both tight end and defensive end. A funny thing happened, Tony. I was ranked number 2 in the nation as a tight end. But I had one problem. The guy who was ranked number 1 was on my team, and I had to be. Russ Francis, you may have heard of. Yeah, Russ Francis was an all-pro. He was a prolific, just a great athlete. He was a hell of an all-around athlete. I mean, decathlon, he was a track guy. He was phenomenal. But what the coaches decided, hey, we got these 2 great tight ends stacked up with each other. We got to do something about this, so we don't want to waste that talent. So let's move one of them. So guess who they moved? They moved Russ. They moved Russ from tight end to linebacker. Now, Russ is 6'6", and needless to say, they moved him to middle linebacker, and he was the tallest target in the Pac-8 at that time. And they could see quite quickly that wasn't going to work. So they moved Russ back to tight end, and they moved me from tight end to defensive end. And the rest, as they say, is history.
And so you said you didn't have any notion to go to the NFL. So how did that come about then?
Boy, you talk about fate. I had no desire, aspiration, or even inkling that I could ever be a professional football player. To me, it was unthinkable. So what happened is they had the draft back in those days. And in those days, I think it went to 13 or 14 or 16 rounds, whatever it was. It was, long. So lo and behold, I was drafted into the NFL. I was drafted in the 11th round, which meant that I wasn't held in high esteem. And I told my wife, I remember, because you have to go back for these camps. And I remember my first camp I was going back to. And I said to my wife, I said, honey, I'm going to this NFL camp. I said, I'll be back in a couple of weeks. If even that, I might be back a little sooner. And I played college football with a guy who I considered my big brother, and he was a mentor of mine. And his name was Tom Graham, and he played in the National Football League. He was 2 years ahead of me, and he was drafted in the 3rd round by the Denver Broncos as a linebacker. He pulled me aside one day, and before I went to training camp, and he said this to me: changed my life, Tony. What he simply says, George, he says, you're going to the National Football League. And if you don't make it, I'll be sorely disappointed. Man, the last thing I wanted to do in my life was ever to disappoint my big brother, Tom Graham, my adopted big brother. And I went to training camp in 1975. And Tony, I had all these illusions about what the NFL was. And the first day of practice, they all dissipated. Every one of them. I thought this was this environment where everybody was and fast and strong and smart and intelligent. It was nothing like that. Now, maybe that was attributable to the New York Giants at that point in time, but I got there and I found, hey, these are just ordinary individuals, just like myself. They walk, they talk, they good, bad, and indifferent. This is no fantastic environment. So being an 11th round draft choice, 1975, I went there. And with the belief from Tom Graham, I competed, and I made the team. But not only made the team, Tony, 1975, I was voted the Rookie of the Year for the New York Giants. Never forget it.
All right, we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back and talk more about George in the NFL and about the Super Bowl.
Do you have the free My Fairfield CA app? Go to your app store and simply type the name My Fairfield CA in the search window and press Get. With this app, you'll have access to multiple services right at your fingertips, including emergency services, public works issues, and water bills. So download the app on all your smart devices. Don't wait until you need it. Get the free My Fairfield CA app today.
Welcome back. We're here with Super Bowl champion George Martin. Now, when you got to the Giants, you said you were kind of underwhelmed.
I guess my imagination had taken over prior to me getting there, and I thought that this was much more voluminous than it was. And when I got there, and not that the Giants were a great team to begin with, but I saw that they were just ordinary individuals. And because of my, believe it or not, Tony, because of my college or my basketball prowess, it gave me an advantage. I had quickness that some guys didn't have, and I had agility and mobility that a lot of guys didn't have as natural football players. And boy, that served me well out on the football field. And boy, I used it to the max.
And now, one of the things that you had talked about was you had been given this thing by your coach to make sure that you're an example. And you took that to heart, because I know that for a long time you would come back to Fairfield. I remember when I was at Grange, and here's this guy talking about setting goals.
Yes.
And show this movie about you intercepting a pass and returning it for a touchdown. I remember that. But when I was watching this, before you won the Super Bowl, too, by the way. This is before they. So this was something that you got into, and how did you get into that, and what was that like for you?
Well, first of all, it was something that I've always been cognizant of. Again, being spurred on by Mr. Miller in high school, was being setting an example and making sure that you give back. That was something that was ingrained in me from my parents. So when I was called after my first or second year to if I would consider coming back to the schools and talking about motivation, absolutely, because that's the environment which I came from, and I have an obligation to give back. So when I had that opportunity, I said yes. I jumped at it with both feet, and I spoke to every school in Fairfield Suisun Unified School District, every one of them. And my premise was always goal setting and being the best that you can be. And it was something I was so proud of, because as I would walk through the door, Tony, it wasn't George Martin, it was the aura that had been created. It was being a professional football player, it was going to college and that kind of thing. And my head didn't swell up, because I knew that it was something, that image that they had conjured up themselves. But I wanted to capitalize on it. I wanted to maximize it. And that's why I always went in and I talked about instilling the thought of them being a George Martin in their own right. So.
And now there are people who are in their 50s and 60s who still look back on that and talk about that, what an impact it made on them.
Yeah,
still, and you're still doing it, right? You're still doing it
all the time. Sometimes I do it by request, or sometimes I'll see something that's not. I'll give an example, Tony. I was at home one day, and I was sitting there. I was doing something, writing or something, and the doorbell rings. Knock at the door, and. I'm now retired. I'm kind of living incognito, which I like, and I love my anonymity. And there was two kids knocked at the door. They're in their teens, late teens, and they said, "Hello, sir." He said, "We heard that you used to be a pro football player." And I said, "Yeah." They said, "Would you mind teaching us and instructing us how to be better athletes?" And I thought about it for a second. First of all, I admired their gumption. They did,
Right.
because they were sweating bullets just to come up and knock on the door. That took some courage in and of itself. And the last thing I wanted to do was, disappoint these kids. And so I said, I applaud them for their bravery and their courage. And I said, yes, I will. And so I began, I took them and I set up a program, a very formal program. I spoke to their guardians, and I also spoke to a friend of mine. I asked him for his assistance, and I laid out a very aggressive exercise and just a skills plan. And we'd go to the park every day, and we'd go up there and we'd practice that. And it was, again, my way of giving back, but not that I was, I felt an obligation, Tony. I felt an obligation. And to me, to have said no to those kids, I couldn't live with that.
So let's talk about the '86 season. So what was that like for you guys? Because you said when you came to the Giants, they weren't necessarily a powerhouse.
Yes.
But then by '86, you got in Parcells before that.
Yes.
And then, so tell me about that '86 season. What was that like?
Well, first of all, I got to set the stage a little bit, because when Parcells came there, he came as a linebacker coach. And he was such an impactful coach that everybody liked Bill Parcells, because our linebacker, we had a reputation as linebackers in the National Football League that was second to none. They were ferocious. They were feared. They were just absolute vicious. I mean, they were the powerhouse of our team with our linebacking core. Subsequently, Bill Parcells replaced our former head coach, Ray Perkins, who died a couple of years ago. And Parcells was anointed to be the head coach, and we applauded it. We were just happy. We were elated. Little did we know, be careful what you ask for. So Parcells came on board, and our first year, horrendous. And that's just the arc. There's a learning. We were horrendous to the point where they were going to fire Bill Parcells. And so at that point in time, I'd gone through the evolution of being a player representative and eventually became a captain and had a little bit of sway with the front office. So myself and the other two captains went up to the front office and we gave Bill a vote of confidence. We want to stay the course because we think and look what he did with the linebacking core. And sure enough, as a result, Bill maintained his job, and 1987 was a magical year for us, man. It was Bill Parcells put it all together. And, man, we were a force to be reckoned with. And with each victory, our confidence grew, our confidence grew, our confidence grew.
And now the NFL, it's about 6, 7 years ago, they compiled a list of all the brothers who have played in the NFL. And I believe there's like 350, something like that.
Yeah.
But we had 2 here from Fairfield, California. So your brother was drafted in 76, right?
Yep, my brother Doug, he showed me how it's really supposed to be done. I was drafted in the 11th round. He was drafted in the first round. I had to pay my way to camp. They gave him oodles of money. I'm kidding, of course. But by comparison, there's no comparison, really. My brother Doug was by choice a football player. I mean that as a compliment. He played the game. I was a converted basketball player. I'm going to tell everybody, I'm not embarrassed by it, but I used my skills as a basketball player to become a football player. My brother Doug, he was dominating as a football player. And we both played the same position, defensive end. Right. He played it the way it's supposed to be played. Me, I improvised. But, it got me to a Super Bowl and a Super Bowl victory. And I think my brother Doug played 10 years and I played 14 years. So very happy with both of our careers.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And now I do want to talk about your book and about your journey for 9/11. Tell me about that, how that started, and why you wanted to do that, and some about that.
Well, we already touched on it, Tony. I talked about my humanitarian efforts to try to save the world, and I tried all of my life, and especially all of my career on the East Coast. And I can recall my transition from the NFL to real life was a smooth transition. And I stayed there in New York, and I wanted to continue to have my impact there. And so I remember I matriculated into the business world. I was a vice president of human resources for a commercial printing company called Tanner Graphics. And I remember I was on the road. I traveled one fateful day, and I was flying back to New York. And the night before I flew back, I decided, I got in late, so I said, I'm going to sleep in tomorrow morning because I just got in late and I was a little bit tired. And as I was in bed, my wife woke me up. She says, honey, you got to wake up. I said, why? What's up? She says, a plane just flew into Trade Towers. I said, you're kidding. And she said, look. And she woke me and I looked, the second plane hit the second tower. Tony, I can't tell you the emotional feeling that engulfed me. But at that time, I felt almost like a native New Yorker. My entire career was back there on the East Coast. I lost friends in that. I lost a neighborhood kid who was like a little family member to us, who was a friend of my son's, died. He was at the point of impact in the tower. And that broke me. That really broke me. See those towers coming down, it really, it never leaves you. It never leaves you. But to see the natural instinct, Tony, boom, flight, people. Right. You look carefully, you see what the hell are they doing? They're going toward who is that? What? Those are the rescue and recovery workers, first responders, who were going toward the disaster in order to save lives. That spoke volumes to me. And years later or months later, when they start to develop those illnesses, those respiratory diseases from inhaling all of that soot and the smoke, there was a need, there was a cry to help them. And I felt a burning desire. That was my responsibility to say, hey, I've given back in small quantities all of my career, all of my life. Here's something that I can make an impact on using my celebrity that they gave me in order to help them. And with that, a journey for 911 was born. That saw me walk from New York City all the way to California, 3,000 miles, raised over $6 million for their care.
That is amazing. And then you wrote a book about it too.
Then I wrote a book about it, yeah, because Tony, I grew up in the segregated South for a while, and I had these apprehensions about what the world was all about. I've been to all 50 states, but I wanted to be able to take a micro trip across and meet people individually, up close and personal. The best thing I've ever done in my life as an individual. And meeting these people on a daily basis, Tony, I could talk to you forever, reaffirmed my belief in humanity. Some of the greatest stories, and one day you and I'll have lunch and I'll tell you about some of them. But it was great because there's a great America out there. It's sometimes shaded now because of the political infighting and bickering, but there are people out there that believe in the red, white, and blue.
Well, George, you have been an inspiration to so many people. I really appreciate you coming here today. I want to thank you for all that you continue to do in helping people to set goals and to achieve their dreams.
Well, Tony, thank you very much for illuminating and allowing me to do so, buddy. It's a privilege.
Thanks for watching. Join us again on Local Legends.